It still feels unreal when I think about it, like one of those moments where life suddenly swerves and you don't even have time to brace yourself. One minute you're sitting under a flimsy tent at your child's funeral, rain soaking through your sleeves, trying not to fall apart in front of people who love you. And the next minute there's a patrol car rolling straight down the cemetery path like grief is some kind of inconvenience. Yeah, that happened. And the crazy part is it didn't start with yelling or sirens or handcuffs. It started with that quiet, sick feeling in my stomach that told me before a single word was said that someone had already decided who I was and how little I mattered. I didn't come back to Port Mason to make a point. I didn't come back to prove anything. I came back to bury my son. Jordan was 23, brilliant kind in ways that still break me when I think about it. The kind of kid who'd call me just to ask if I'd eaten. You know what I mean? A drunk driver ran a red light and erased him in seconds, and for days after that, I moved through the world like a shadow doing what needed to be done because stopping felt dangerous. I asked for a small funeral because I didn't want attention, didn't want whispers, didn't want to be Judge Brooks in that moment. I just wanted to be a mother saying goodbye. No security, no official cars, no titles. Just rain, a few folding chairs, my brother Andre, and a casket that felt too small for the life it held. The officer showed up like he was late to something more important. Tires crunching over gravel meant for hearse's siren chirping once almost playful. He stepped out with that look some men get when they're itching to feel big chest-out hand near his belt, eyes scanning faces instead of listening to the room. He didn't see grief. He saw an audience. "All right, wrap it up," he said loud enough to slice through the hymns. "Party's over." I remember thinking, did he really just call this a party? Andre stepped forward, voice shaking but polite, explaining we had a permit, explaining this was a funeral. The officer didn't even really look at the paper. He chewed his gum, rolled his eyes, said there'd been a noise complaint, said cars were parked where they shouldn't be. It was a lie so obvious it was insulting, and we all knew it, but lies don't need to be good when you think nobody can challenge you. Then his eyes landed on me sitting quietly under the tent, and something in his expression sharpened. He pointed like I was an object. "You in the hat," he said, "that dark SUV with the out-of-state plates, that yours?" I looked up slow because grief makes everything feel heavy. "Yes," I said. That was it. That single word flipped some switch in him. Suddenly my car matched a description. Suddenly he needed me to step away from the casket. I tried to keep my voice calm, tried to explain that my son was being buried, that the vehicle was registered, that he could run the plates. He laughed, not nervous laughter, cruel laughter. He said, "You people come down here think you own the place. You people." I felt that phrase land like a slap, familiar and ugly. The funeral director tried to intervene, hands up, voice pleading, and the officer snapped at him like a dog, threatening to tow every car, threatening arrests. The mourners went quiet. Jordan's classmates stared in disbelief. I stood up because sitting suddenly felt impossible, and I stepped out into the rain, soaked immediately, but I didn't care. I reached into my purse and said I could show my ID, that there had to be some misunderstanding. That's when he yelled, "Gun." There was no gun. There was never a gun. There was a black woman reaching into her bag, and in his mind that was enough. He grabbed my wrist, twisted it hard behind my back, slammed me against the hearse. I remember the cold metal on my cheek, the smell of rain and mud, and the unbearable fact that my son's casket was inches away and I couldn't even turn my head to see it. Andre rushed forward, and suddenly there were more officers, hands near tasers, voices barking orders like this was some kind of tactical operation instead of a funeral. The cuffs snapped tight, too tight, biting into my wrists. I told him he was making a mistake. He leaned close, breath sour, and told me that's what they all say. I said my name. I said I was a federal judge. For half a second, just half a second, I saw doubt flicker. Then he laughed again, louder, meaner, like admitting doubt would kill him. He said I didn't look like a judge. He dragged me away from the hearse, my heels sinking into mud, popping off, leaving me barefoot on wet gravel. I held my head up because humiliation only wins if you let it. Andre was shouting that he was calling everyone. The officer smirked and said the governor didn't care about noise complaints. Inside the patrol car, it smelled like bleach and old sweat. I sat there with my hands numb behind my back, watching the funeral disappear through a metal mesh, watching my brother drop to his knees in the rain, and something inside me hardened. I wasn't scared. I was furious. The officer glanced at me in the mirror and said, "Maybe if I cooperated, we could work something out." I looked straight back at him and told him to remember that moment, the rain, the cuffs, his own voice. because one day that memory would be the only thing he had left. He laughed, turned up the radio, drove fast on purpose, taking turns so sharp my shoulder slammed into the door again and again. He was enjoying it. He thought he'd caught someone powerless. At the station it got worse in a quieter way. Fluorescent lights, bored faces, jokes. He paraded me through the back like a trophy, bragged about the big fish he'd caught. When I asked for a lawyer in my phone call, when I calmly stated the legal violations, they laughed and said I sounded like a lawyer because I watched too much TV. He added charges like they were toppings: resisting assault, disturbing the peace. When I questioned the assault charge, he leaned in and said I'd hurt his wrist when he cuffed me. "Welcome to the system," he said. The cell door closed with a heavy clang that echoes in your chest, and for a moment I just stood there, breathing in the smell of despair, feeling grief claw its way back up. But here's the thing, people don't always understand. When you've spent your life fighting systems, you learn how to survive inside them. I didn't sit. I stood and I started documenting everything in my head. Time, names, words used, injuries, rights violated. I locked my grief in a corner of my mind because I needed clarity. Outside that cell, he was laughing with coworkers, mocking my voice, saying he loved it when they begged. Someone asked if he'd run my plates. He shrugged and said he knew what he saw. He started typing his report, planning to bury me in paperwork and keep me locked up through the weekend. And then the phone started ringing. You could feel the shift before anyone said anything. One phone, then another, then the sergeant's personal cell. I heard his tone change from casual to confused to terrified. Chairs scraped, voices dropped, someone shouted the officer's name. Suddenly the laughter was gone. The cell door opened and the sergeant stood there sweating, calling me Your Honor, apologizing, saying there'd been a mistake and I was free to go. I didn't move. I told him I wasn't leaving without my attorney and federal oversight, that this was a crime scene and I was the victim. He looked at me like I'd spoken another language. Minutes later, the front doors burst open and the building filled with people who didn't need to shout to take control. My brother ran to me. Federal agents started securing terminals. The officer tried to delete his report, and someone stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. The man who'd swaggered into a cemetery suddenly looked small, backed into a corner by consequences he hadn't believed in. When they cuffed him, really cuffed him, I watched his face go pale, watched the disbelief settle in. I told him quietly that he hadn't been doing his job. He'd been feeding his ego, and that seeing a black mother as nothing was not public safety. And then my body gave out. Stress does that. Trauma does that. My chest tightened, my knees buckled, and I collapsed right there on the station floor. An ambulance, a hospital room under a false name, security outside the door, doctors telling me my heart had issued a warning shot. The headlines exploded while I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying the sound of cuffs clicking in my ears. The department called it a misunderstanding. Regrettable. I turned off the TV and laughed a sharp, humorless laugh. Yeah, regrettable. When I got out, they tried to settle fast. Quiet money. Sign here and go away. I said no. I didn't just sue the officer. I sued the city, the department, the supervisors. I wanted discovery. I wanted to see what lived in the dark, and what we found was rot. Complaints buried, patterns ignored, group chats full of jokes about profiling, about making people cry, messages from the day of the funeral talking about teaching her respect. It made my stomach turn. Then there was the dash cam footage, mislabeled forgotten, showing that same officer planting evidence on a young man years earlier, a life ruined for sport. We found him working a job he never should have had to take, and I asked him to testify. He asked why I was doing this. I told him the truth. My son couldn't speak anymore, so I would. The trial felt like standing in a storm, cameras everywhere, lawyers trying to spin cruelty and distress. They said the damages were excessive, that it was just a bruised wrist. The funeral director cried on the stand, describing an officer laughing near a grave. The young man described losing his future. When I testified, they asked why I hadn't just shown